Hello everybody, I'm Miss Jessica from EVPL Oakland, and we are here for our Chapter Book Storytime Variety Pack where we read just a little bit of a book so that you can preview it and see if you would like to continue reading it. The last time that we were together, we did our Plinko board and we landed on mystery, and I am so very excited about today's book. It is one that I get requested all the time. I actually had to put a hold on it so that I could check it out for this program. There are new books coming out in this series, and so this is one that is continuous, and I know they just had a new one not too long ago, and I had so many requests for it. So because of that, it caught my eye. What is it about this book that everybody is loving? So it is a very, very good mystery, and it is called The Green Glass House, and this is by Kate Milford. So we are going to see what it is all about. It's winter time at Green Glass House. The creaky Smuggler's Inn is always quiet during this season, and Milo, the innkeeper's adopted son, plans to spend his holidays relaxing. But on the first icy night of vacation, out of nowhere, the guest bell rings, then rings again, and again. Soon, Milo's home is bursting with odd, secretive guests, each one bearing a strange story that is somehow connected to the rambling old house. As objects go missing and tempers flare, Milo and Meddy, the cook's daughter, must decipher clues and untangle the web of deepening mysteries to discover the truth about Green Glass House and themselves. Okay, already I'm in. I have to know what's going to happen in this story. And we always want reading to be a good experience. So I have my snuggly blanket. I have my snuggly kitty Luna's joining us again. And I even have some iced coffee off to the side just in case I need to get a drink. All right, so let's get reading. Oh, and we have a really great illustration. Okay, chapter 1, The Smuggler's Inn. And I do want to show you this illustration with this chapter as well because that looks really fun. There is a right way to do things and a wrong way if you're going to run a hotel in a smuggler's town. You shouldn't make it a habit to ask too many questions, for one thing. And you probably shouldn't be in it for the money. Smugglers are always going to be flush with cash, and as soon as they find a buyer for the 8 cartons of fountain pen cartridges that write in illegal shades of green, but they never have the money today, you should, if you're going to run a smuggler's hotel, get a big account book and assume that whatever you write in it, the reality is you're going to get paid in fountain pen cartridges, if you're lucky. You could just as easily get paid with something even more useless. Milo Pine did not run a smuggler's hotel, but his parents did. It was an inn, actually, a huge ramshackle manor house that looked as if it had been cobbled together from discarded pieces of a dozen mismatched mansions collected from a dozen different cities. It was called Green Glass House, and it sat on the side of a hill overlooking an inlet of harbors. A little district building, half on the shore and half on the piers that jutted out into the river. Out into the river's side rack with the teeth of a comb. Like the teeth of a comb. My goodness, that sentence. It was a long climb up to the inn from the waterfront by foot, or an only slightly shorter trip by the cable railway that led from the inn's private dock up to the steep slope of Wilford Hill. Wilforber Hill. And of course, the inn wasn't only for smugglers, but that was who turned up most often. So that was how Milo thought of it. Milo had lived at Green Glass House ever since he'd been adopted by Nora and Ben Pine when he was a baby. It had always been home. And he was used to the bizarre folks that passed through the inn. Some of them coming back every season, like the extended family who showed up to pinch your cheeks at holidays and then disappeared again after 12 years. He was even pretty good at predicting who was going to show up when. Smugglers were like bugs or vegetables. They had their seasons, which was why it was so weird when the huge old bell on the porch, the one that was connected to the winch that drove the cable that in turn hauled the car up its tracks, started ringing. The old iron bell's tone changed with the seasons too, and with the time of day. This evening, the first of winter vacation, was cold and brittle, and the snow had just begun to fall. Today, therefore, the bell itself had a brittle tone. It had a sound like a gulp of frigid air. Milo looked up from the coffee table where he was working on a math problem. He liked to get his homework out of the way right off the bat, so he could enjoy the holidays without thinking about school. He glanced at his mother, who was sprawled across the rag rug in front of the big stone fireplace reading someone's can't talk. In front of the big stone fireplace reading. "Someone's coming up," he said. Mrs. Pine got to her feet, tucked her book under her arm, padded across to the foyer, and peered out the window by the door. "Someone wants to. We'd better go start the winch." "But we never have guests the first week of vacation," Milo protested. He had a vague sense of unease start to rise in his stomach and tried to swallow it down. Vacation couldn't possibly get spoiled so quickly, could it? He'd only stepped off the launch that ferried the Quayside kids to and from school a few hours ago. "Well, not often we don't," Mrs. Pine said as she laced up her boots. "But that's not because we have a rule about it. It's just because that's the way it usually turns out." "But it's vacation!" His mother shrugged and held out his coat. "Come on, kiddo, be a gentleman. Don't send your mom out into the cold alone." Ah, the all-powerful gentleman card. Still grumbling, Milo got to his feet and quietly whispered, "Vacation, vacation, vacation," as he slouched across to join her. He had just about finished his homework. That was supposed to be the end of responsibility for a while. The bell rang again. Milo gave in to his frustration and stopped in the middle of the foyer with one boot on and gave a single furious yell with his hands clenched at his sides. "Arrgh!" Mrs. Pine waited with folded arms until he was finished. "Got that out of your system?" she asked gently. Milo scowled. "I know this isn't the usual routine," his mother added, "and I know you don't like it when things don't happen the way you expect." She bent a hut in the catch-call basket beside the door for a flashlight. "But look, being surprised isn't always a bad thing." The fact that it sounded logical didn't change the way Milo felt. Of course. But he nodded and finished getting dressed for the cold. He followed his mother out onto the porch and across the lawn to a break in the dark wall of bare white birches and blue-green firs that covered the hillside. There, in a pool of deeper shadow, the grass gave way to a stone landing. All his life, ever since he was really small, Milo had been very bothered by the sudden change of plan. More than bothered. Being surprised made him uneasy at the best of times. Now, tromping across the fresh snow and the bitter cold to haul a stranger up the hill, an unexpected stranger who was going to require him to work when all he really wanted was a quiet week or so with his parents and his house to himself? Well, that made the uneasiness feel uncomfortably like panic. The flashlight's beam pierced the pool of shadow, which flickered and melted into butter gold. Mrs. Pine had turned on the light in the little pavilion hidden in the trees, where the cable railway landed. The railway began 100 yards below at the river. There were other ways to get to the bottom of the gorge or to get to the top if you were down. There was a steep and winding stair that ran more or less parallel to the railway and led to the same pavilion. There was also a road that snaked away from the inn around the side of the hill down into the city proper, which was about a 20-minute drive away. But only Milo, his parents, and the inn's chef, Mrs. Carraway, ever really used the road. Guests didn't come from the direction of the city. Guests came by the river, sometimes in their own boats, and sometimes by paying one of the dozens of old tars in the quayside harbors who'd ferry a person to Green Glass House in their equally aged boat for a few bucks. Given the option of being hauled up the steep hill by an antique conveyance that looked like a demented and oversized bumper car on rails, or climbing 310 steps, Milo had counted, they always chose the former. Inside the stone-floored pavilion were a bench, a shed, and the steel tracks of the railway. Mrs. Pine unlocked the shed and Milo followed her inside to where the heavy cable that ran between the tracks looped around the giant spindle of the winch. Thanks to a complex mess of gears, once you got the winch going, it did all the work necessary to haul the car up the slope. But it was old and the lever tended to stick. Getting it moving was easier with two pairs of hands. Together, Milo and his mother grasped the lever. 1, 2, 3, Milo counted as they hauled it forward. The cold metal of the gears whined like an old dog, and then they started to turn. As Milo and Mrs. Pine waited for the rail car to click and clank its way to the top of the slope, he wondered what kind of person it was bringing up. Smugglers came in all kinds. And of course, sometimes the inn had guests who were sailors or travelers and not smugglers at all. But very often, and almost never in the winter, when the side rack and its hidden inlets were so often frozen. While Milo was thinking, winding strings of glittering white firefly-sized lights came to light, outlining the pavilion and trailing off down the hill along the railing of the stairs. His mother straightened up from where she had just plugged them in. So what do you think? An elf on the lam from the North Pole? A pop gun runner? Eggnog bootlegger? She asked. Best guess wins a brownie sundae. Loser makes it. What are those flower bulbs Grandma always sends you at Christmas that you love? Paperweights? Yeah, it's a guy with a cargo of those and stockings. Green ones with pink stripes. A low whine joined the creaking of the cable around the big spindle in the shed. You could tell where the rail car was by how the sounds it made changed. Milo pictured the misshapen old iron lamppost the car would be passing right about now. Green and pink stockings? Yeah, he probably knows it was a bad idea, but now he's stuck with them. He was forced to take the cargo on. No, tricked into it. And now if he can't move it, he's ruined. He's already trying to figure out how to convince people to switch from baskets to striped stockings for Easter. Milo leaned over the pavilion railing and peered through the thickening snow falling amongst the birches and the icing the pine branches, searching for the first glimpse of the car and its passenger. It was still out of view, but from the vibration of the rails he knew it was being hauled up the steepest part of the slope now. He's got meetings set up with people this week too, magazine writers and some weird TV star, trying to see if he can make green and pink stripes a big fashion thing next year, and a sock puppet company. He leaned over the railing again, just far enough out that a few flakes of snow managed to make it past the roof onto his eyelashes. There it was, the blue metal nose of the rail car with its silver racing stripes, painted a few years back by Milo and his father, along with its name, Wilforber Whirlwind, on the sides. And then, a moment later, its passenger, a lanky man in a felt hat and a plain black coat. Milo could just make out a pair of oversized glasses with huge tortoiseshell rims on his nose. He wilted. The stranger looked disappointingly like somebody's grandfather, maybe even a bit like a school teacher. I don't know, Miss Pine remarked as if she'd read Milo's mind. I could kind of believe that guy would take a chance on green and pink stripes. She ruffled his hair. Come on, kiddo, put on your welcome face. I hate the welcome face, Milo mumbled, but he straightened up and tried to look cheerful as the whirlwind made its final ascent up to the pavilion. Up close, the stranger looked even more boring. Plain hat, plain coat, plain face, plain blue stripes. Plain blue suitcase stuffed into the boot of the car. Beneath the glasses, through his eyes, were bright and sharp as though they flicked from Mrs. Pine to Milo and back. Milo felt himself stiffen. It always started this way. However, the Pines met someone new. You could just about see the person's thoughts. One of these things is not like the other. This stranger was hiding it better than most for sure, but there was no change in his expression, but that didn't mean he wasn't thinking it too. How did a Chinese kid end up in Nagspeak with that lady for a mom? Obviously adopted. The car came to a jerking stop at last, nearly sending the unexpected passenger's face straight into the Wilforber Whirlwind's padded dashboard. Hi! Milo's mother beamed as the man clambered out of the car and brushed the accumulated snow from his shoulders. Welcome to Green Glass House. I'm Nora Pine. This is my son Milo. Thank you. The stranger said, his voice just as boring as the rest of him. My name's Venge 𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐴𝐸𝐵�ve. Well, Milo thought sourly, he had an interesting name at least. I'll get your suitcase for you, Mr. Venge. Oh, that's all right, Mr. Venge said quickly as Milo reached for it. Let me carry that. It's quite heavy. He grasped the handle and pulled. It must have been very heavy. Mr. Venge had to put a foot up on the side of the car and push off for leverage, which was when Milo's mother gave him a significant glance. Uncomprehending, Milo took another look at the stranger. Then he spotted it. One garishly striped sock, visible for just a moment before Mr. Finch stumbled backwards with his suitcase. If anything, the orange and purple combination was even weirder than Milo's imaginary green and pink. "Looks like maybe I owe you a brownie sundae," Mrs. Pine whispered, then louder, "This way, Mr. Finch. Let's get you in and out of the snow." Milo's father was waiting when they reached the porch. "Hey there," he said, reaching out to shake Mr. Finch's hand and taking his suitcase with the other. "Ben Pine, rough night for travel, huh?" "Oh, it's not so bad," Mr. Finch replied as he stepped inside and shucked off his coat. "You got in just in time," Milo's dad went on. "Weather report says we might see 7 or 8 inches of snow tonight." 𝐸𝐴𝐵𝐵 smiled. It was like a vague smile, a quick smile, but it was there for just a moment. Like he was pleased about getting snowed in, basically alone in a remote lodge in a strange part of town. "You don't say." Milo thought the smile was weird, but then again, the guy did have a weird name, and he was wearing weird socks. Maybe he was an oddball after all. "I'll put some coffee and hot chocolate on, Mrs. Pine said as he led Mr. Finch through the dining room to the stairs. "Let me show you to your room, and we'll be glad to send something up to you so you can warm yourself by the fire down here." "How long do you think you'll be staying?" Mrs. Pine called. Mr. Finch paused, one foot on the bottom step. "I suppose that depends. Do you need to know right now?" "Nope, you're our only guest at the moment." Mr. Finch nodded. "Then I guess I'll let you know." Milo followed his father and their guest up the staircase. The inn had 5 main floors. The living room, dining room, and kitchen, all of them big open rooms that flowed from one to the next, were on the first floor. The Pines' living space was on the second. The guest rooms took up the 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors. The staircase that connected them was wide with carved banisters on both sides. On each floor, there was a landing and a turn so that the stair doubled back on itself, and each landing had a huge stained-glass window. Mr. Pine led Mr. Finch to the 3rd floor, where the doors to the 4 guest rooms stood open. "Your pick, Mr. Finch. Any preference?" Their guest wandered down the hall, peering into each room as he passed. He paused at the end where the door to the old dumbwaiter was, then turned back to Milo and his father. Except Milo had the impression that Mr. Finch wasn't exactly looking at them, but past them. Milo turned and saw only the stained-glass window and the snowy night beyond, tinged in shades of pale green, celery, and tones like old bottle glass. "This one will be fine," Mr. Finch said after a moment, nodding to the room to his left. "Sounds good." Mr. Pine set the blue suitcase just inside the door. "Want us to send up a hot drink?" Before Mr. Finch could answer, the brittle peal of the railway bell rang out again. Milo stared at his father, shocked. "Another one?" he demanded before he could stop himself. Then he clapped his hands over his mouth, sure that had to have sounded horribly rude. "I'm so sorry," Mr. Pine was already saying to the guest, shooting dagger eyes at Milo, but Mr. Finch didn't appear to have noticed Milo's faux pas. He looked just as shocked as Milo felt. Is that the bell I rang?" he asked in a strange voice. "It sure is," Milo's father said. "Sounds like we have another guest." He turned to head back downstairs, flicking Milo on his left ear as he went. Not hard enough to be painful, but just enough to let him know that even if Mr. Finch had missed Milo's rudeness, his father hadn't. "Shall we send up coffee or hot chocolate, something to snack on?" Mr. Finch frowned and shook his head. "No thanks. I'll come down in a few minutes. I confess I'm curious to see who else is traveling tonight." Milo's father took the stairs 2 at a time and caught his wife just as she was about to go back out into the snow. We've got it, he said. At any other time, Milo might have felt annoyed at being volunteered. Never mind if one guest threatened to spoil his vacation. 2 spoiled it for sure. But now, the sheer improbability of 2 separate guests showing up at this time of the year made him more curious than upset. Not only that, 𝐸𝐴𝐵𝐵 had been shocked when the bell rang. On one hand, he was right to be shocked that another guest was on the way. On the other hand, how could he possibly have known the inn was usually deserted at this time of year? Unless, Milo thought as he pulled on his boots, Mr. Finch was here because he figured he'd have the place all to himself. That was the moment Milo first started thinking, maybe there was something odd going on. But then his father opened the door, and a nice stroke of windy night cut into the foyer. Milo zipped up his coat and stumbled out into the cold after his dad, trying to walk so that his steps matched the footprints Mr. Pine had left in the accumulating snow. They had to send the Will Forber whirlwind back down the hill, Milo's mother having reasonably assumed it had made its last upward trip for a while. "What do you figure?" Mr. Pine asked as they watched the blue car disappear over the slope. "I gotta tell you, and don't tell your mom, I was really looking forward to having a few weeks off duty for a while." "I know!" Milo exploded. "I already did my homework and everything." "What's the deal with Mr. Venge? I didn't get around to asking what he does or what brought him here, did you?" Milo shook his head. "He's got some pretty crazy socks on. That's all I know." Milo's father nodded seriously. That was one of the many great things about Milo's dad. He always took whatever you said seriously. Milo didn't have to explain why it seemed meaningful that the guy who appeared to be so boring and normal wore such bizarre socks. His dad would get it. The engine that drove the cable jerked to a halt. The whirlwind had reached the bottom of the slope. A moment later, the bell rang again to signal that the passenger was aboard and ready to begin the trip upward. Mr. Pine disappeared into the shed for a moment to throw the lever. Milo and his father leaned on the railing by the side by side in silence, staring through the trees and waiting for the first flash of blue. That was another great thing about Milo's dad. You could hang out with him and say nothing and still feel like you'd spent time together. Milo's mom wasn't good at that. Oh, she always had interesting things to say, and they had fun conversations every time they talked. But his dad was good at quiet. The snow fell, trying to blanket trees and ground at night with silence, while the winch and the cable and the rails in the car made their familiar mechanical noises, as if they were having a conversation while they brought up the new guest. And then, at last, there was the Will Forber whirlwind, and inside it, hunched a vivid blue umbrella topped with snow, was a lady. As the rail car passed under one of the old iron lampposts, the night falling through the umbrella seemed to turn her hair blue, too. She looked pretty young to Milo, or younger than his parents anyway. She smiled and waved as the whirlwind approached, and Milo found himself smiling and waving back. The car came to a lurching stop, and the lady swung her umbrella over to one side, knocking off the snow and closing it up. Her hair stayed blue, a darker shade than the metallic cobalt of the rail car, but blue nonetheless. "Hi," she said, her voice bright. "Sorry to drag you into the snow." "No problem," Mr. Pine said, offering a hand to help her out. "It's what we're here for. I'm Ben Pine, and this is my son, Milo." "Georgiana Moselle, Georgie," the blue-haired girl said. "Thanks." "Can I carry your bag for you?" Milo asked. She nodded, pleased, and pointed to a carpet bag at the boot of the car. "Sure thing. Thanks, Milo." Milo hauled it out and started back through the trees to the inn. Before Mr. Pine followed, he paused to send the rail car back down the hill, muttering, "Just in case." Inside, there were hot drinks waiting. Milo could smell cider simmering on the stove the second he opened the door. Mr. Venge was waiting too as Mrs. Pine came into the foyer and introduced herself. He peered around the side of one of the big chairs in the living room, gave Georgie a curious look, then disappeared back into the depths of the chair. "Let's get you a room first. There's coffee, tea, hot chocolate, and cider," Mrs. Pine said, as their second guest stepped out of her green rubber boots. "Ben, what room did you put Mr. Venge in?" Georgie stopped dead in the act of pulling up her woolen socks and gave Mr. Pine the oddest look Milo had ever seen. It was as if her face was divided in half. The bottom part was all innocent smile, but the top half was wide-eyed in unmistakable disbelief. "You have another guest?" Mr. Venge leaned around the chair again, smiling blandly behind his oversized glasses. "Dick Harry Venge, just arrived myself." Georgie Moselle," said the young lady with the blue hair. The odd expression flickered on her face, like she really didn't want it there anymore, but knew it would look weird if she stopped smiling right now. Neither she nor Mr. Venge made any effort to shake hands. They just stared at each other, as if each other was trying to figure out something about the other. Milo glanced over to see if his parents had noticed this bit of awkwardness, but somehow they seemed to have missed it. "Mr. Venge is in 3E, Mr. Pine said to his wife, busy with his own coat and boots. "You don't mind showing Miss Moselle up?" "Glad to. Milo, you want to bring that bag?" "Sure." Milo watched the two guests continue to size each other up. Then Georgie turned and abruptly followed Mrs. Pine toward the stairs. Milo trailed after. Third floor okay? His mom asked. Hardly seems worth it to make you hike up any higher, not when there's only the two of you. Oh, I don't know, Georgie said brightly. How often does a girl get a whole floor to herself? Might be fun. Fun? Why on earth would anyone want to walk up 3 flights if she didn't have to? Also, Milo knew from experience, having camped out in every room at some point or another, it was pretty creepy being the only person on a floor. The inn made noises, floorboards creaked, old wind panes rattled, hinges groaned. But of course, his mother was not at all about to tell a guest. She couldn't hike up an extra flight of stairs if she wanted to, so they kept on going up to the 4th floor. Let's see how much we have left. While the stained glass window was on the 3rd floor was done in shades of pale green, the one here was mostly blue, cobalt and robin's egg and navy and powder and turquoise, with a few bits and pieces here and there that seemed, with the dark sky behind them, to match the guest's hair precisely. Georgie Moselle beamed at it. Look at that! Obviously, I belong here. Mrs. Pine waved an arm. Any room you like. Then I forgot to ask, how long do you think you'll be staying? Not sure. A week, maybe 2. After a quick look inside each, Georgie chose a room at the far end. Milo followed her to 4W and set the carpet bag and the folding luggage rack just inside the door. Or at least, that's what he meant to do. Instead, he dropped the bag into the thin air and fell 3 feet or so to the floor with a thud. There was no mistaking the crunch of something breaking inside it. Georgie was kneeling next to the bag before Milo had even decided whether to apologize or scream. I'm so sorry, he babbled, staring from the bag to the luggage rack, which for some inexplicable reason stood to the right of the door rather than to the left where it should have been. Every room with a W had a door that opened inward and to the right, so the luggage rack was always on the left. It's fine, Georgie was saying. Don't worry about it. But something broke, Milo protested. Georgie was busy throwing clothes and toiletries that appeared to have been shoved randomly into the bag out onto the floor and in search of whatever had broken. Milo stared in horror as the pile grew. Jeans, pajamas, a jar of face cream, underwear. I'll get a towel or something, he said helplessly. A book with a bent cover, a water-stained journal with loose pages escaping to flutter across the room, a plastic zipper bag of makeup and lipsticks, and then there it was. Georgie lifted 2 dripping pieces of broken pink faceted glass. The smell hit Milo's face a fraction of a second later. Alcohol and something spicy, flowery. He'd broken a bottle of perfume. Oh my God, Mrs. Pine exclaimed from the hallway. Oh, I'm so... She gagged involuntarily and ran down the hall. A moment later, she returned with a waste bin from one of the other rooms. Throw it in here. We'll replace it. Of course. I'm so sorry. I'll take anything that needs washing and I'll do it up right away. Georgie sighed and dropped the glass carefully into the bin. It's not a big deal. Please don't trouble yourself about it. I don't know why I shoved the bottle in the bottom of the bag like that anyway. She gathered up her clothes in her arms, dumped them on the yellow knitted blanket on the bed, and began to sort them into piles. Milo's mother gave him a sharp, questioning look. He paused in the act of picking up the rest of Georgie's belongings. The luggage rack is on the wrong side, he protested, jabbing an accusatory finger at the offending piece of furniture. They're always opposite the way the door opens. Who moved it? Milo? Mrs. Pine held out the waste bin expectantly. He sighed and deposited Georgie's things on the desk, which fortunately was right where it was supposed to be. Then he took the bin and escaped down the hall. He'd gotten all the way to the utility closet on the 2nd floor when he emptied the bin of its flowery, vile-smelling, eye-burning contents when he realized he still had Georgie Moselle's book under one arm. Great. Well, he'd have to face her again sooner or later. Milo sighed and tried not to dwell too much on how the luggage rack not being where it was supposed to be, on top of vacation not happening, and the way it was supposed to happen made it seem kind of like the world was trying to drive him crazy. He started back up the stairs, which was when the bell rang for the 3rd time. Milo turned abruptly and sprinted down the staircase to the main floor, past a staring Mr. Vinge, narrowly avoiding plowing into both his father and the silver coffee pot he was holding. I'll get it, he shrieked at the top of his lungs. All right, we are still not done with chapter 1, but we're going quite a bit long on this one today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. There is the little snowflake that kind of indicates a break to where it's kind of pausing for the next scene in the story. We are still quite a few pages away from the end of chapter 1 to get to chapter 2, and I don't want to go too much longer. So if you would like to pick up where we have left off on the story, I'm actually stopping on page 18, and the bell has just rang for the 3rd time. So if you happen to read this on your own, that's where we have left off. And I do want to mention really quickly, let me look at my cheat sheet here, that the Green Glass House, we do have this as an e-audiobook on Hoopla. We also have it as an ebook on Overdrive, and it's Libby is the app that you can get on your device, on your phone. And then we also have it as an e-audiobook on Libby as well. So if you'd like to continue the story just by listening to it, there's some good options for you, or you can continue it as an ebook, or you can reserve it as a print copy and come to any of our locations to pick it up. All right, so I'm really confused as to why they're having so many guests and why the guests seem to be curious about each other and surprised that somebody else is there. And also, what in the world is so heavy in Mr. Venge's suitcase? And I have so many questions. And if Milo is going to start questioning why he is there, because he's obviously a different race than his parents. There's so many mysteries that I already need to know the answers to. So I hope you keep reading the story as I am going to as well. And we're going to pause here for just a moment so that we can do our Plinko board to see what genre we're going to be reading next time. All right, I'll be right back. All right, so we are about to do our Plinko board to find out what we're going to be reading next time. And there is a slight noise in the background. I think one of my neighbors is doing something a little with construction, so I apologize if you can hear that. All right, so we've got our Plinko board. We've got our different categories: fantasy, humor, historical fiction, adventure, science fiction, adventure again, realistic fiction, mystery, and spooky. All right, now I am tilting it back a little bit because these things like to fly off. So hopefully we can get it in one try. Let's see. We literally just had mystery. Try this again. I'm actually going to start over here. See if that helps at all. Humor. We haven't had a humor book in a while. All right, so the next time we're together, we will be reading hopefully something that you find a little bit funny. All right, I'm Miss Jessica from EVPL Oakland. Thank you so much for joining us today. Don't forget, you can go to our website and our social media to find out all the fun events that we're having, all of the different things we're offering, and we hope to see you again next time. And thanks again for joining us. Bye.